looking like a goopy carcass in your path. Not that anyone ever came back this far anymore, but just in case. At the back of the barn in the last stall, he moved aside the stack of rotting wood pallets and lifted the layers of moldy cardboard away. There was no handle on the trapdoor anymore, but just enough gap in the floorboards to get a grip. He raised the flap and let it rest against the stall wall. Then he climbed down the ladder inside. The root cellar, if that's what it had been, was no more than 6 by 6 in the antechamber, and then maybe twice that on the other side of the door. There was just enough light from above to show him the sliding panel he'd installed a long time ago. He opened it now and dropped in the granola bars and the juice boxes. Neither of the two inside spoke to him. They'd stopped trying after the first few days. But he heard one of them stir and a soft scrabble across the floor. Then, "Ethan? Ethan, here." There was the crinkle of plastic wrappers and the sound of them gobbling down the food. If they'd figured out what was in the juice by now, they didn't much care. He sat crouched with his back against the door, listening. It never took too long once the juice was gone. Their breathing slowed and became regular. Within a few minutes, they were both out cold. Record.
Everyone's gonna want to know what I was thinking. They're gonna wonder what kind of monster could do something like this, and they're gonna make a lot of assumptions. But maybe, just maybe, this is all for a reason that you can't see right now. Did that ever cross your mind? I know that Ethan and Zoe don't deserve their fate, but then again, neither did I. You think I wouldn't rather be somewhere else right now with nothing to say? I only wish I was that lucky. So, here it is. If you want to know what I'm thinking while I'm doing this, I'll tell you. The answer's simple. I'm thinking about my son, my love. What are you thinking about?
Stop.
Chapter 64. Ryan Townsend was a fidgety kid. Not that I could really blame him. He had a police detective staring him down from one side and his parents on the other. His feet never stopped swinging back and forth the whole time we talked. It had taken half a dozen phone calls, but Congressman and Mrs. Townsend had finally given me some time to speak with their son. All on their terms, of course. We met on Saturday, 8:30 a.m. at their sprawling mansard-roofed house on 30th Street in Georgetown. This shouldn't take too long, I told Ryan up front. I've read everything you told the FBI agents already. Most of it's about the fight between you and Zoe on the morning of the kidnapping. It wasn't a fight, the congressman cut me off. He and his wife were both perched on a clawfoot settee across from me. With all due respect, Zoe hit Ryan with a book and bloodied his nose. Let's just be clear about that. Ryan sat lower in his chair. His bare feet scuffed the walnut floorboards a little faster. Fair enough, I said. Ryan, what I'd really like to know is how things got so bad between you and Zoe to begin with. Is that even relevant? Mrs. Townsend asked. Surely you're not suggesting Ryan had anything to do with this. Nothing like that, I said. I'm just trying to learn as much about Ethan and Zoe as I can. I think your son might have a unique perspective. This is why I wanted to meet with Ryan alone, but that issue had been a non-starter with his parents. They had every right to sit in and every intention of doing so. Go ahead, Ryan, his father told him. We've got nothing to hide here. You can answer the question. Ryan took a deep breath and puffed out his cheeks. Zoe started it, he said. We were on this field trip to Air and Space Museum last year, and I left my phone on the bus. Then she gets this stupid text from me. I mean, not from me, from my phone. And she just freaked. Sweetie, don't say freaked. Mrs. Townsend gave me a quick, self-conscious smile. Ryan rolled his eyes. The congressman checked his BlackBerry. Anyway, she got all in my face about it and didn't believe me when I said I didn't do it. So I said, fine, let her believe it. Ever since then, she just kind of had it in for me. I wasn't convinced I was getting the whole story. But more than that, I just wanted to hear Ryan tell it. His words, his memory of the details. Do you know what was in that text? I asked. I didn't send it, he said right away. I swear. That's fine. I just need to hear what happened, I said. From you. Ryan, answer the detective's question. Do you know what was in the text or not? The congressman asked. For the first time, Ryan was looking me right in the eye. He wound the drawstring of a crimson Braniff School hoodie around one finger, then unwound it, then wound it up again. Finally, he said, Do you think they're dead? Ryan! His mother looked horrified. That's a terrible thing to say. I think he was just trying to change the subject, but I answered him anyway. I hope not, I said. Then I tore a page out of my notebook and slid it across the table. How about if you write down what was in that text, and we'll call it a morning? Ryan twisted around in his chair to look at his father again. The congressman nodded, and I set my pen down for him. He cupped his hand around the page while he wrote something, then turned it over and weighted it under an antique snow globe on the coffee table. For a few seconds, some glittery snow flew around the miniature Victorian house inside. Can I go now? He asked. You can go. Thank you, Ryan. That was helpful. I waited for him to leave the room. Then I turned the paper over where his parents and I could see it. In a ragged, kid's handwriting, it said, Zoe D., I want to come on your tits. Oh, my God, Mrs. Townsend looked away. That's absolutely disgusting. The congressman took the paper off the table and pocketed it before there could be any question about my keeping it. We're going to speak with Headmaster Skillings about this, independent of anything else, he said. I could understand their embarrassment, but the profanity seemed like typical middle school bravado to me. Sad, but true. It's just the kind of thing a boy might write to impress his friends, sometime after the hormones started kicking in and before he really understood what it all meant. In any case, I thanked the Townsends for their time and quietly let myself out of the house. When I got back to the car, I scribbled a single note to myself for later. Where is Zoe's phone? Chapter 65. I spent most of that day crisscrossing the city, interviewing other Braniff students who knew either Zoe or Ethan and socialized with them. Then late in the afternoon, I drove up to Riverdale, Maryland for one last stop. This one was unannounced. George O'Shea lived on a corner lot in a gridded middle-class neighborhood just off the east-west highway. I parked under the basketball hoop on his freshly black-topped driveway and went up to ring the bell. He was smoking a cigar when he answered the door. At Braniff, O'Shea's custodial uniform was always clean and pressed, but here he was wearing an old flannel shirt open halfway down his chest. I could hear a game on the TV somewhere behind him. It's Detective Cross, right? He said, squinting at me through the fly-specked screen. Sorry to come down on a Saturday, I said. We're working around the clock on this. Just a few follow-up questions, if you don't mind. For a brief second, he looked like he did mind, like he wasn't entirely sure I was giving him the whole story. And I wasn't. Ever since I'd met O'Shea, my mind kept coming back to him. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a vague sense that behind all the smiles and the interest in police work, there was something he wasn't saying. It was only a hunch at this point, but I've taken action on less than that before. How's it going anyway? He asked. Any good leads or whatever you call it? Nothing I can really talk about, I said. He nodded and rocked back on his heels. Right. I understand. Still, must be interesting work, huh? I watched him through the door. What was he thinking about right now? Do you mind if I come in? I asked. Oh, yeah, of course, he said, like it hadn't occurred to him. I was just ruining a pot of coffee. You want some? No, thanks. I'll try to be quick here. He thumbed over his shoulder as I came in. Let me just switch off the machine. Make yourself comfortable. I hung back and looked around as he headed toward the kitchen. Must be a real drag working on the weekend, he called back. That's the one thing about my job. At least I got a nice, regular schedule. Uh-huh, I said, fingering through his mail. It was out on the end table, mostly bills, mostly unpaid. A dusty collection of salt and pepper shakers sat in a curio cabinet on the wall. Speaking of schedules, do you keep records of the custodial staff's time at the school? I asked. O'Shea didn't answer. An announcer on the TV hooted out his approval for a double play that had just gone down, and I knew right then that something was wrong. George? When I got to the kitchen, it was empty. No George anywhere. The back door was wide open, and I could see O'Shea out on the lawn, scrambling over his chain-link fence toward the street. The son of a bitch was making a run for it. Chapter 66. There's nothing that pisses me off like a foot race I don't want. When I ran out of George O'Shea's house a half second later, I think I bent his screen door right off the frame. O'Shea was a big guy. The kids at Braniff called him Hagrid behind his back. But he was a lot faster than he looked. By the time I was out on the street sprinting after him, he was halfway up the block. Clearly, he had a good reason to run. "Don't do this, George!" A guy raking his leaves had already taken out his phone when I passed. "Call the police!" I yelled at him. I noticed he took my picture first. Two kids on the sidewalk screamed at me and pedaled their big wheels like crazy, trying to keep up. The top of the block ended in a cul-de-sac. O'Shea cut up between two of the houses and kept going. When I caught sight of him again, he was trying to scale a tall cedar fence in somebody's backyard. He had to jump a couple of times before he got a grip on the top of it and started pulling himself up. Then the plank in his hand cracked. He slipped back down a few feet, and that's when I caught up with him. I got hold of his ankle before he could muscle all the way over, and I pulled him right off the top of the fence. That brought him down fast, but he took me down with him too. And he wasn't done yet. My cuffs were out, just as O'Shea popped up onto one knee and elbowed me hard under the chin. My head snapped back. I tasted blood. In fact, it was probably the blood that helped me add a little speed and leverage to the right hook I gave him in return. That was enough to knock him back on his ass again. This time I took out my Glock. "Roll over, face down, hands on your head," I told him. He seemed half out of his mind. Even now he started up at me again, but only until he saw the gun a few inches from his face. "Don't, George, please. Don't," I said. It was like all the fight drained out of him at once. Even his face dropped, and he just melted back down to the ground. When I put the cuffs on him, he started to cry. "What have I done?" he kept saying over and over. "Oh, God, what have I done?" That was my question exactly. Chapter 67. The backtracking and denials started in my car and continued over the next several hours. O'Shea was taken directly into FBI custody. I drove him in myself, right through the sally port at the side entrance to the Washington field office. From there, it's a straight shot back to the interview rooms on the ground floor. Word was kept tight. There would be no announcement of the arrest yet, not until we knew more from O'Shea. A forensic unit was dispatched to his house in Riverdale. Another one went to his office at Braniff to see what they could turn up. There was no question that O'Shea was hiding something. It was only a matter of finding out what it was. Around 7 o'clock, we got word back from the team out in Riverdale. A Dell laptop had been found in O'Shea's master bedroom closet. It was loaded with pornographic images, most of them involving children. George O'Shea seemed to have a thing going for little girls, kids as young as 3 or 4. It was stomach-turning stuff, but as a piece of evidence, this was more than enough to hold him. By the time Peter Lindley arrived, straight from LX1 in Langley, adrenaline was running high in the observation room. "What have we got here?" he said, taking a file from one of the assistant special agents in charge. "George O'Shea," the ASAC told him. "He's the head of maintenance at the Braniff School." "I know who he is, for God's sake. What have we got?" Lindley said. He seemed to be in his usual bad mood. Several other agents stepped out of the way to make space for him at the one-way glass. On the other side, O'Shea was sitting with a bureau supervisor from the Child Abduction Unit, Ken Mugatande. They'd been talking for 2 hours straight now. O'Shea was slumped forward with his head resting on his clenched fists. "He's ready to admit the porn's his," I told Lindley, "but he swears up and down that he doesn't know anything about Ethan and Zoe's disappearance." "He's begging for a polygraph," the ASAC said. Lindley turned and glared at the agent. "This is the guy whose office is 25 feet from that tunnel under the school?" Nobody answered. It was a rhetorical question. "So, what the hell are we doing here? Let's get him down to the polygraph room, now!" Chapter 68. The field office's polygraph room looks a lot like the other interview rooms. Small table, 2 chairs, plain white walls, and a big one-way mirror. If anything, the observation space is smaller. A dozen of us squeezed in there to watch the interview. "What is your name?" "George Luther O'Shea." "What is your address?" "It's 1109 Edgewood Road, Riverdale, Maryland." O'Shea had asked for this, but he looked even more miserable than before. He was wired up with pneumographs around his chest and abdomen, a blood pressure cuff on his arm, and 2 finger clips, all feeding into a laptop on the table. The polygrapher was Sue Pilgrim, a forensic psychologist out of